Sono qui in compagnia di Bell Hooks, pseudonimo di Gloria Watkins, scrittrice africana-americana, teorica femminista, poeta. In Italia per presentare i primi due suoi libri in lingua italiana, Elogio del margine, una raccolta di saggi pubblicati per Feltrinelli, e Scrivere al buio, un'intervista pubblicata dalla Tartaruga Baldini Castoldi. Bell Hooks, che non avrebbe bisogno di grandi presentazioni perché negli Stati Uniti e in molte parti del mondo è conosciutissima, è un personaggio molto particolare del mondo culturale, intellettuale e politico nordamericano, perché quasi unica è riuscita a essere attiva all'interno del movimento delle donne, mettendo insieme due categorie che molto spesso il femminismo americano ha dimenticato di tenere presenti, ricordando che appunto non basta riconoscersi come donne e riconoscere appunto lo sfruttamento e l'oppressione che passano dalle divisioni tra uomini e donne, che bisogna evidentemente tenere sempre presenti altri due punti, quello della razza e quello della classe. E quindi coniugando pensiero politico femminista, pensiero politico antirazziale e pensiero politico, quello tradizionale anche europeo. Adesso io vorrei rivolgere una serie di domande a Bell Hooks perché da sé ricostruisca un pochino non soltanto lo sviluppo del suo pensiero, ma anche in quali condizioni si sia prodotto il suo pensiero. Ultima cosa che voglio ricordare, Bell Hooks, che ha al suo attivo 16 volumi pubblicati negli Stati Uniti, vari di teoria politica, vari di poesia e negli ultimi anni 2 volumi di autobiografici, e che ha oggi neanche 46 anni, ha scritto il suo primo saggio teorico, Ain't I a Woman? Non sono una donna anch'io, quando aveva soltanto 19 anni. Ecco, io vorrei partire da lì e rivolgere una serie di domande a Bell Hooks proprio su come nasce il suo pensiero, all'interno di quali condizioni, e vedere che cosa l'ha portata qui oggi. Bell Hooks, I would like you to tell us what made you write in 72-73 your very first essay, Ain't I a Woman?
That was the period when contemporary American feminism was reaching a big peak. It had begun in the late 60s, this sort of brewing sense that on the back of civil rights struggle, that white American women were beginning to think again about the question of women's rights. And I was suddenly taking all of these women's studies classes where I was one of a very few black women, and white women were saying things like, we have not worked, and we can be free if we worked. And they were saying women have not worked. But I was coming out of this world where women had always worked, where black women had always worked outside the home. So it made me think for the first time in a deep and intellectual way about the differences in the life conditions and status of black women and white women in the US.
That has created to you, let's say, a conflict, a political conflict with white feminists, or you found a way to deal with these differences and these diversities?
The conflict with white feminists was that they all wanted to believe that gender was the only thing that mattered. I mean, there used to be this early story that I would tell in these meetings that when white women would say, when a baby is born, the first thing that you notice is what sex is the baby? Is it a boy or is it a girl? And I said, no, if you're black in America and the baby is coming out of the womb, the first thing that you notice is what color is the baby? Because you know that if it's light or dark, it will determine the condition of that child's life. That if the child is lighter, they will have a greater chance of being a success. So that was one of the early stories I used to talk about the way in which race and gender together shape our identity and our possibilities.
There is a third element you, since then and still today, consider together with race and sex.
Well, the third element is class, of course, because added to my own understanding about race and gender was the reality that I had come from a very working class background into a very privileged class university. So I knew that on the level of class, women did not share totally the kind of common experiences that privileged class white women who were talking about sisterhood is powerful, women have all this stuff in common. They were in denial about the fact that, in fact, women who were service workers did not have a lot in common in terms of the dailiness of their working lives with leisure class women. That, in fact, when it came to issues of work, they had more in common with the men of their class than they did with women.
Do you recognize nowadays any kind of use of, let's say, I would say use to that idea of sisterhood?
To me, sisterhood is an incredibly wonderful evocation of the possibility of political solidarity and community between women, but not unless it's based on a realistic assessment of women's lives. When I have discussions with Italian feminist and sociologist Laura Balbo, part of what we talk about, having been in friendship for 20 years, meeting in an intellectual and academic setting where I was a student and she was a professor, is that we can only have true sisterhood when we are honest about where we are coming from. When she's honest about her class and the way it shaped her reality and her identity, and I'm equally honest. And that honesty is not something that's just simply happens. It is about struggle.
When I was proposing you to interview you a couple of years ago, I remember that your first reaction was, why bother? Why should I be interesting for Italian women? Why Italy should be interesting for me? And it was an interesting point. Then you gave me the interview, and now you are in Italy. I would like you now, after all these experiences in Italy and the interview and so on, if you have found an interest in Italy, and if you think there is a way to communicate between the two countries.
Well, I'm particularly interested in Europe right now and the changing nature of Europe. Throughout my time here, I've been quoting a particular quote from James Baldwin, the African-American novelist and essayist who died in the late 60s, where he says, the world is white no longer, and it will never be white again. Part of my own interest in Europe has been the fact that Europe is becoming a multicultural world, no longer the sort of white world of the past. And so a lot of my work right now is looking at what does the US now have in common with a Europe that has become way more multicultural than it ever was in the past. The fact is that the whole notion of who we think belongs in the world has been changed by migration, by refugees, all of these things. And this makes topics that have been talked about for some time in the United States and in South Africa, for example, particularly the topic of race, more immediately relevant to a changing Europe, because a changing Europe now has to deal with the question of racial apartheid in housing, in jobs, all of these things that weren't part of people's lives years ago because they didn't have populations of people who were visibly marked by their skin color as different.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about this, your idea of diversities? Not difference, diversities.
Well, diversities implies that we can have a culture that is not static. For example, people are often so disturbed in Europe about the idea of foreign cultures, particularly, let's say, people from Africa and the Middle East coming, and yet we all see that America has had a tremendous cultural impact on Europe. But that's a culture that is predominantly white. So in fact, people have no trouble adjusting their cultures to take in aspects of American culture that are different from traditional Italian culture, etc. It's when the people who are bringing the different culture are non-white often that the problem begins, that people begin to feel a sense of there's a threat here. What's happening to our neighborhoods, to our cultures? If we think about popular music in places like London, where so much mixing and hybridity is going on, I think that these are the issues that when we talk about diversity, we're talking about what does it mean to live in cultures where you can keep the best of your traditional cultures and at the same time be altered by the presence of different ways of thinking, of knowing, of living one's life.
Listen, Belle, in your work, there is a key concept, which is oppositional gaze. You very often quote and say, I developed an oppositional gaze vis-a-vis with a dominant culture. I would like to ask you two things. How did you develop this special gaze? And how do you use it today?
To begin with, I want to remind you that I've been writing these children's books, and part of it was as early as a childhood, I realized that the way I saw myself was different from the way the predominant white culture and mass media saw black children or black people. So that in some ways one develops an oppositional gaze in response to colonization. That is to say, think about the fact that if you're a Native American Indian in America and you turn on your television set, what you are likely to see imaging yourself is the Indians being slaughtered by the white man. Many white children in America think that Indians don't exist anymore, that they've all been wiped out, because that's what the television images say. So what happens to a small Indian child who is looking at this image? Either they feel negated or they have to create a different image. And that's where the sense of opposition comes from. You both create a different image of yourself, but you become also critical of that image that's coming to you from the mainstream.
How did you make it? Because I see the necessity of it, but which one was the process? Why you made it? And so many people don't.
I think so many people don't because most people refuse to question and go along with the status quo. My students always ask me, how can we become critical thinkers? Because I feel like one of the reasons I made it was by becoming a critical thinker. And whenever they say, how can I become a critical thinker? I say, by asking questions. Most children are critical thinkers. They ask questions. They ask who, what, when, where, why. Those are the basic questions any of us can ask. It's like, for example, if you take a simple bias, racial bias that we learn whenever we learn history as children. Columbus discovered America. Now, you'd normally discover something because no one else knows about it. If you say who, what, when, where, why, you say, well, why did he discover it? Were there no people there? Then you would say, actually, there were these people there, Native American Indians. So how could he discover it? So right there, when you begin to ask questions, you begin to develop an oppositional perspective, one that differs from the mainstream perspective.
Listen, Belle, in the very first volume of your autobiography, Born Black, you talk about what we could call curiosity, and the need as a child to oppose a father who was asking to all the children, male and female, to keep quiet, to shut up. And you didn't shut up as a child. But you were the only one in your family, and you were like 7 altogether, 6 sisters, one brother. You didn't shut up, and that was a big problem for you and for your family. Do you see any link between that original opposition and curiosity and your critical thinking?
I think almost every child wants to be able to and free to ask questions, to give their point of view. But in so many patriarchal, and we know that my family was a very religious family, so there was a whole sense that children should be seen and not heard. Children shouldn't ask questions, and they certainly shouldn't disagree with their elders. So I think that, for me, that whole sense of having the courage to speak out as a child, I don't know where that came from. To me, that's a mystery. You know, why me and not my sisters who are often silent, or my brother? That is the part of life I just can't understand. And my sisters and I often talk about what made me more willing to oppose the status quo than them. That we will never know.
But there is, let's say, a consequence. It's a coherent development between that child and your present being.
Well, absolutely, because to some extent, every child has to oppose their parents to grow up. That is to say that they have to, at some point in teenagehood, or begin to think for themselves. And I think what we know is lots of people don't ever begin to think for themselves. Because in a sense, the state functions like a parent, telling you how you should think and feel and act. So that partially, it was for me a gesture of self-love that I learned through books, to be willing to oppose and to think for myself. I think this is a really important question at this point in our history, because throughout the United States, people will often talk about the rise of fascism in Europe, especially Nazism, and say, you know, how could so many Jews stand there and let one Nazi soldier kill them? And I think all the time about, well, I sit in classrooms where people have total freedom to speak, and yet they won't speak if their opinion differs from the rest of the group, because they are afraid of being attacked by the group. Or once a student said to me, I'm afraid to say what I think in class because I won't be liked. And I said, is that your only problem in life, that you won't be liked? But I think that says that people are so socialized to go along with others, that to be able to take a stand is a very difficult thing, particularly for young people today, to have the courage to go against your peers or to go against the will of authority figures, even if you don't respect them, is very difficult.
You must be an incredible teacher. For example, one of your books I found more useful for me is Teaching to Transgress, where you develop, let's say, a pedagogical discourse. Could you tell me something about your relationship with your students? For example, the age gap. How do you deal with that? How do you develop their consciousness, their critical thinking?
Well,
do you have exercises, a practice?
First of all, I think teaching well is like being in a community, in the sense that you have to know who it is you're teaching. So that one thing I always try to do at the beginning of my classes is to get to know students, to have them say relevant things about themselves, for them to get to know each other. Because in a sense, we're trying to create a learning community, and you can't learn together unless you know what your common concerns and issues are. So that a lot of my students, we spend time writing paragraphs, which we read to each other. I might ask them a question, and they might read a paragraph. All of us, and I would write as well, we get to hear each other's voices. We get to hear the uniqueness of each person's experience and thought. So that's one way to begin to create a certain kind of community in the classroom that is open, that invites people to take risk and have courage in stating what they think and feel.
Do you have mainly women, or you have also men in your classes? What exactly you choose to teach in your classes?
Now, my PhD is in American literature, and I wrote my dissertation on the African-American woman writer Toni Morrison. My classes tend to span being about feminist theory, cultural criticism, or just plain American lit classes where I could teach any writer. I prefer to teach black writers, both black writers in the US and black writers in the diaspora, because there are so few courses that focus on those groups of writers. Mm-hmm. So I teach, for example, a Toni Morrison seminar.
You are also a poet. Actually, you started writing as a poet. How do you combine your writing as a poet with your writing as a theorician? Or you also collaborate with magazines. You write about popular culture. You have CDs. You work for television once in a while. How do you keep together all these different experiences of writing and communicating?
Well, I think the key word there is communicating, that if you're really interested in reaching the widest audience possible, then you have to use all the different forms that are available to us to communicate with people. And I think that particularly if you have a political project like feminism, like ending racism, you have to convert people, because we've all been socialized to be sexist, to be racist, to accept injustice, differences in class, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to change that, then you have to come up with ways of talking to people where they are. You have to start where people are. All change has to start where people are. If you try to impose change, as we've seen throughout history, it often does not work.
That's why, for example, you write books for children, or very often you write about movies, very popular movies like The Bodyguard or Crying Games or whatever, Spike Lee's movies, and you always are very clear and very direct, and you don't try to be like the high critic. And also, attached to this, since you are also a teacher, you are a professor at a university, how do you deal with the academia?
Academia, to me, is many things. One, the university in America, like universities everywhere, remain important places for the exchange of ideas, but essentially they are conservative places. The most radical place at any university is inside the classroom itself, because the professor can do whatever you want within the classroom in terms of how you present ideas. So it's in the classroom that I have the opportunity to encourage my students to open their minds, to question, to be willing to critically interrogate. For me, it's been that spirit of openness that I can bring to the learning community that makes academia still a good place to be. It's not a good place in so many other ways, because like all other corporate structures, it's not a place that is really interested in learning and the building of learning communities. It's primarily interested in reproducing a professional managerial class.
You are very critical vis-à-vis with the women's studies, the current women's studies. Could you tell me exactly why, nowadays, not in the past?
Women's studies has been wonderful in the sense that it created an intervention like Black studies in the traditional way of knowing. It created new epistemologies, that is, new ways for us to know things. And that is a valuable contribution to academic knowledge and academic worlds. My criticisms about women's studies have simply been that whole focus solely on gender and not on all the other factors that shape women's thoughts, lives, and who we are in the world, like race and class. Today, the difficulty of women's studies is that we've sunk into this kind of academic jargon where masses of people can't even read books by feminist thinkers that may have incredible ideas, but that are being expressed in language that very few people who don't have high levels of education and leisure can understand. I mean, you can read a book that's really, really difficult, but you need time. And many people who work long hours don't have time to come home and pore over a metalinguistic, jargonistic feminist text. So that I think that the academicization of feminism has been very harmful to the building of a mass-based feminist movement that would continue to try and convert men and women to the project of ending patriarchy.
Even your ideas are not simple and easy to convey, but you are working hard on language. And not only language, the format of the communication. Because I don't think at all that your idea of a sexist, racist, classist society to fight against is an easy concept. So if you could tell me something more about the effort you are making to invent a language and new formats of communication.
I think it's not just new forms of communication, it's a new perspective. A perspective, for example, here in Italy. What will it mean for people to think about Italy in terms of race, gender, and class? What you do, how you live in the world, how you know what you know. And I think that, for example, as a black woman who, when I come to Italy, and I come as this celebrated writer, professor, and everyone is being so wonderful, and then I walk the streets of Italy, and I learn something different about what it is to be a black woman in Italy when I walk the streets. When I walk the streets, I learned that black women are looked upon with contempt and hatred, that most black women are perceived to be prostitutes. All of these negative, racial, sexualized, sexist images of black womanhood, which are also images that were popular in the States right before there was racial integration. So in a sense, we see that stereotypes arise. For example, we know there are white prostitutes in Italy, but every white woman that takes the bus or takes the train isn't seen as a prostitute. Whereas every black woman that takes the bus or the train may be seen as a prostitute by the largest group of people looking at her. So that in of itself is a way where when you think about it, you can change your perspective. You can say, why do I see this person this way? Why am I looking at that person and judging her on the basis of skin color alone? I know nothing about her. Would I want to be judged myself on such limited knowledge?
This is exactly what you do, for example, when you work and write as a film critic. We see the same movie, but we see different things, because your gaze moves to a different direction from mine. I have in mind the two critics you wrote about Bodyguard and Crying Game. You were the only critic in the world, I think, who said the issue at start in the two movies is not male-female, not just male-female, but black and white. So don't you think it's just a question of what you are looking for?
I don't think it's just a question of what you're looking for, because it's also a question of what is there and what we don't see.
Right.
For example, I had my students go to see a movie, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Yeah.
There are no black people in that movie. But when they came back to class and I said, describe what you saw, most people said they saw a family, a working woman, a father who stayed at home. Very few people said a white family. Then I sent them to see a Spike Lee movie. When they came back, they said they saw a black family. So we had to say to them, well, why is it that one family is racialized in your mind? Why do you see blackness when you see that family? But when you go to the movie where the family is all white, you don't say, a white family. And in this way, they learn how do we look at things? How the way we look at things has been shaped by a system. In that case, a system that says to them, white is normal. White does not have to be identified because it is the sign of power. It is not something that you have to locate. Whereas blackness, you have to locate it. And this goes back to the gaze, because when you see blackness and acknowledging it, it's also a way of subordinating it. Whereas white maintains its hierarchical power over precisely because of its absence. That you're not a white woman to yourself. You look in the mirror and you're a woman. You stand for universal woman. I mean, I was talking here in Italy about the whole way in which cultures who have opposed fascism are now getting involved with the idea, for example, of a European community. And if you look at the documents that define what is a European community and a European, we see very Eurocentric notions of Greece and the sense of origin. We don't see anything in the documents that define a European that talks about Europe's engagement with Africa and Asia and the way in which there was a kind of appropriation of cultures and ideas that would in fact say to us, there is no pure European. There is no pure, quote, white culture. That in fact, all our cultures are hybridities. They've all been informed by mixing and border crossing. And if there's anything positive at all to say about imperialism, is that it was precisely imperialism that created the context of diversity. Were it not for militarism and imperialism, there would not be all the refugees and immigrants, whether they're people coming from Bosnia or people coming from Rwanda. All of these are the consequences of war, of imperialism, of economically driven strife between people and between cultures and countries.
Last question. A key word in your work, yearning. I would like you finally to tell me exactly what you meant, because I really believe it's not just your political position hiding there, but an indication of some possible change for everyone.
Yearning is rooted in intense longing. I mean, I tried to talk in the introduction to yearning about the fact that I think that we talk so much about the things that distinguish people, that make us different from one another, and the conflicts we have. And I say here that surely our desire for radical social change is intimately linked with the desire to experience pleasure, erotic fulfillment, and a host of other passions. There are many individuals with race, gender, and class privilege who are longing to see the kind of revolutionary change that will end domination and oppression, even though their lives would be completely and utterly transformed. The shared space and feeling of yearning opens up the possibility of common ground where all these differences might meet and engage one another. It seems to me that a lot of times when we organize politically for change, we organize on the basis of a notion of there's one up person and there's a down person. I was suggesting that a space we have in common across our differences is our longing. One longing that I talk a lot about is our longing for love, our longing to connect in community with others. So I propose, what would it mean for us to think about political strategies in relation to that space of longing, of our desire to live in a world of peace? I'm sure if you go around the world and ask most people, do you want to live in a world full of peace and the possibility of joy for everyone? Most people would answer in the affirmative. And yet we are living in a world that is, totally full of strife and conflict, so that there's a gap between people's longing, their yearning, and how we're actually living in the world. I think that's part of why someone like the Dalai Lama has come to be such a spokesperson for ending domination in the world, because he speaks about the possibility of peace, and that we can come together, not on the basis of shared experiences, but that shared longing for justice, for peace.
Thank you very much.